Requesting connection. Established. Encrypted. We're live. The show you've been asking for. Advice, technology, and community. Linux first, all others second. This is Ask Noah.
Live from Multispeed Technologies, the Ask Noah Show starts right now. This is the show where we came to do all the things on Linux they said couldn't be done and take your questions on how to do the same. The phone lines are open this hour. To be a part of the program, it is a free call, 1-855-450-NOAH. That's 1-855-450-6624, or send an email to live@asknoahshow.com. My name is Noah Chalaya. I am your host, delighted to be here with you as another episode of the Ask Noah Show kicks off this hour. Joining me again is Mr. Steve Evans. Steve, welcome to the program.
Hi, Noah. Thanks for having me back again.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to be here again. So I want to start by talking about our Element bot or Matrix bot, whatever you want to call it. It was put out by the community, and one of the things that I forgot to mention is that this bot is available 24/7, 365. So if you send your questions to the questions bot, which you can find at questions.linuxdelta.com, it's real simple. It will put those questions right in front of my face, and Steve and I will address them as they come in. Now, if you think about it on the rerun, you say, dang it, I missed my opportunity to send questions to the questions bot. Well, fear not. The questions bot is there 24/7. When I get into the studio, then the next week, the questions bot will have those questions, again, right up in front of my face. And so if you have questions, get them answered. You'll see the bot remind you at the beginning of the show. The German healthcare system may be switching to Matrix. We're there a long time ago. Our first email comes in from Patrick. Patrick writes in and says, hi, Noah. On episode 241, you suggested some Gmail alternatives. One of the alternatives that you mentioned was Proton Mail from Switzerland. In my opinion, it's not that great of an alternative for Gmail. The Swiss privacy laws are not as good as their reputation. Proton Mail is required to cooperate with the Swiss security authorities by law. See here. And then he links to the Proton Mail data laws. Greetings from Australia, Patrick. So I would start by saying this, Patrick. I would start by telling you that no software is going to be completely immune from the pressure of the government in the country from which it's hosted in. However, I would also add to that the technical design of Proton Mail makes that somewhat irrelevant. Proton Mail doesn't have my private security keys. Therefore, I don't have to even trust Proton Mail, let alone trust the government in which the country in which Proton Mail resides in. It's far too many steps removed. I'm the only one that has access to those private keys, and they're only unlocked with my very long passphrase that exists only inside of my noggin. And so if the Swiss government can come to Proton Mail and they can say, hey, Proton Mail, we want Noah's data. And Proton Mail will say, okay, we have no choice but to comply. Here you go. Here are the scrambled hashes that we have on our server. Well, but Proton Mail, we want to decrypt all of this. We want to read Noah's email. Well, you'd have to go talk to him about that because we don't have his private key. That only exists inside of the private key, I guess, is encrypted with a passphrase that exists inside of his head. So you're going to have to get inside of there. We can't give that to you. We'd love to give that to you, but we can't give that to you. So to a certain degree, it doesn't matter, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Steve, you've been a user of Proton Mail basically as long as there's been a Proton Mail. What are your thoughts on this?
So I actually took some time to read through a good chunk of what the link had to say. So the link is in German, so it's not for our German listeners. Have at it. I happen to speak German, so I was able to kind of pick through it. I thought it was kind of interesting. It was I found it a bit slanted in the way that it was written, but brought up some interesting points. I think that if I'm going to go with someone who's hosting my mail, which I do, I'm comfortable with this because, like you said, we've got the GPG keys that are encrypted and the way that you can rotate your own keys when you want to. On top of the fact that they're very clear about the fact that if you mess up your key, like, we can't help you. That gives me some level of confidence that they're not, adding another key on top of it. Because with encryption, you can have a second key to the data, and that's also part of the mechanism built into it to allow you to rotate your keys if you need to. One thing that did occur to me, though, I'm not sure that things like the beta for Proton Drive and the calendar are covered by the GPG key, because those are covered, but like the encryption is covered per mailbox. When you set one up, it asks you what type of encryption you want to use, and it kind of gives you a breakdown of what options there are. I don't recall that for your calendar. And so I guess if you're worried about people having access to your calendar, that might be something that you might put on a Nextcloud or something of that nature, which is actually what we do at my house. Rosanna, my wife, and I, we use a Nextcloud calendar to kind of keep in sync. So I'm comfortable with it from the standpoint of someone else is already hosting this, and you take some level of risk when you do that anyways.
Absolutely. If you look at the landscape options out there, I don't know that there is another provider that is doing more to try to ensure the privacy of your email than Proton Mail is. Andy N is very open and honest about what they can do, what they can't do. And when people come to try to circumvent, and this is governments, right? When governments come to try to circumvent Proton Mail, he's been pretty open and honest about, hey, we're gonna fight the good fight. And so if I had to trust a company to do that, I don't know who else I would trust. But the idea of the episode was to give you ideas of other alternatives out there. I think Proton Mail, I spent probably the least amount of time focusing on Proton Mail, partly because I think most people have heard of it, but also because we've talked about it all the time. And again, Andy comes on this program frequently. So if you're looking for other alternatives, I'd invite you to check out that episode. But for me personally, I trust Proton Mail almost unequivocally. I will point out that in the chat room, which you can visit at geeklab.ninja, there's a discussion unfolding on exactly where the security begins and ends. It's important to understand that, because if you're sending an email, for example, from Google or from Yahoo or from Fastmail, any of these other providers that aren't supporting end-to-end encryption and are sending it over the SMT protocol, obviously there's an easy way to intercept that mail. So the only time that mail is truly encrypted is when it's going from a Proton Mail address to another Proton Mail address. At that point, the email is encrypted. Now, I'll add to that and say that at least even if it's coming over SMTP, at least the mailbox, the storage of the mail is all encrypted. And so should an attacker try to compromise your email box, unless they were able to capture that email in transit, or, and this is another point of attack, they're able to capture the outbound email, so they compromise the person who sent the email to you. Unless they're able to do that, they wouldn't be able to get access to your email. Of course, you could reverse the process and say they wouldn't be able to see your sent mail because that's encrypted. But if they were able to compromise the recipient's mailbox, then obviously they might be able to get your message that way. So if you want pure encrypted communication, don't use email, right? Go over to something like Element, which is designed for end-to-end encryption, or Signal or Wire. But as it relates to email, I don't know that you're going to do much better than Proton Mail. Our second email comes in from Ben. Ben writes in and says, hey, Noah, on the last, or at least a very recent episode of Ask Noah, you spent some discussion about Apple and its privacy stance and motivations more generally. I think that in general, the problem with Apple is the problem that all publicly traded companies optimize for a single thing, and that isn't privacy. It isn't the welfare of their customers. Charlie Stross had a good talk about this and about corporations as slow AI. And then he gives a link to that talk, which we'll have linked for you in the show notes. What I would tell you, again, my answer to that is a company's highest goal should be to serve its customers well. And so in the case of Apple, it may very well be that serving its customers well means cooperating with local governments and local officials to make sure that they can continue to produce a very large-scale device that works with every major manufacturer and every software vendor, because they're working at a scale in which they can do that. One of the things that I think about all the time, and we try to at Altispeed Technology is skate to where the puck is going to be. And so what we talk about in our planning and vision casting meetings is obviously not where technology is today, but where is it going to be in 10 or 15 years. And so when we have those meetings and we talk about those things, what we see is a future in which you're a business owner and you go to start up a business. You don't need to hire a company like Altispeed per se to come set up your network and manage your Wi-Fi and all of that, because that's probably being done at that point by your ISP. They already handle the network farther upstream. Now we have the ability to have all of these devices connected to the internet and indeed managed over the internet. And if we can do that today as a managed service provider, there's no reason that the ISPs won't eventually step into that space. When they do, that part of our business is probably going to go poof, right? And so then you start looking at, okay, what about the end user devices? Is there any management needed on those things? Well, we look at what Microsoft is doing and okay, they're moving up to the cloud. You look at what Apple is doing. You go into a store and purchase an Apple device and that's all tied to the cloud. So there's a very real future in which a future business owner or a future person goes into their mobile service provider and purchases a device for $500, $600, $700, $1,000, whatever it is. And they have that device. It's tied to the internet because the service provider is paying them. They're fine paying a monthly fee for that. They don't care if they have administrative access to it. They don't worry about data storage or backing up their data because that's all handled by the cloud, and they're fine paying a monthly fee for that. In that scenario, in that reality, they've gotten to a point where they don't need independent contractors. They can manage everything themselves. They just pay a monthly fee and they have access to a device. The only reason that works, the only reason that that model is a potential is because Apple can go to all of the software manufacturers and all of the companies and say, hey, you're a hotel chain. Why don't you make an app for our platform? And then your hotel won't have to pay, these IT companies and won't have to pay to maintain all this infrastructure, won't have to pay all of these service charges. You just buy the whatever, install the app, and it will just work. But in order to get those hotel chains to sign on, fast food chains to sign on, all of these larger businesses, and to make software and to host their platforms on Apple's platform, they have to be a big enough company to do that. And so if that's their goal, if that's what they're skating to, and that's how they define serving their customers well, then I think Apple is on a really great path. Where I think that misaligns with users is if they come out with a message of we care about your privacy, and then they take steps to do something that does not benefit the privacy of the user in any way, shape, or form. In fact, it does the very opposite. And the motivation behind that is primarily to cooperate with investigative agencies or governments. That's to me, that's an impedance mismatch. And I no longer think that if a customer believed that they were being served well by Apple because they cared about their privacy, and now that's no longer happening, then there's an impedance mismatch. And that's where I take issue with the decision that Apple is making. But to your point, yeah, I entirely agree. I think that when you're a publicly traded company, you do what's in the best interest of your stockholders because that's how you make money. And that's ultimately the goal of any corporation. But I would come full circle and say that the best way to make money, or the long way successful way to make money, is to serve your customers well. And you need to understand what it is that they're asking and what they want, and then execute on that. And so to the extent that we've been able to do that at a much, much smaller scale, at Altispeed, I've seen that be successful. And so I question why, when a bunch of people were willing to jump on that bandwagon with Apple, that, hey, this is finally a company that cares about our privacy, and then they just veer left turn. And I go to my friends like Ryan and say, hey, Ryan, you were all on board with this. What do you think now? And he goes, I'm completely off board now. I don't even know what to think. That seems like an impedance mismatch. Steve, you have any thoughts?
So I think that the idea of serving your customer is probably pretty accurate. And I don't think that they're not serving their customer by making this move. I don't have to agree with it, but I do have to recognize that the user base that is concerned about the moves that they're making recently are relatively small. And while we may be noisy in our own circles, we're probably not the overall target audience. They're probably targeted at people who say, you know what, I like it that they force apps to tell me what permissions they're using, or I like this kind of granularity. And, I think that we should do what we can to help stop child pornography or, whatever egregious social bad that's out there.
Totally.
And there are a lot of people that are willing to make that trade-off. Just as an anecdote, there's in North Carolina, they're spending a large amount of money to essentially alert the surrounding areas of people who have even been accused of some sort of sexual crime or aggressiveness. They call it domestic crimes. And this just kind of shows you what's happening is all you have to be is accused, and then all of a sudden people in your area are aware of where you are because you have to carry this thing until your name is cleared. And it seems that this is the way that we are going as a society. And so if that is the way, that is obviously trading that privacy for something else. And maybe Apple actually is serving their user base by doing this.
Excellent point. I want to move on to our third email, which comes in from David. I think I'm pronouncing that right. He writes, Windows 10 has a volume shadow service, VSS, that allows apps like Casper to make full images and bootable clones of Windows disks while they're mounted and running. Any apps do this for Ubuntu? I want to make images and clones of my Ubuntu 2104 drive while it's mounted and running. Can this be done with LVM? Can LVM be run on Ext4? Ubuntu 2104 system, or is this for servers only? I'm using TimeShift to take regular daily system snapshots, and that's working great, but I also want to make full images and clones without unmounting my main drive and without booting from a live USB stick. I read about something called Continuous Data Protection, or CDP, and Linux Hot Copy, but it seems that only works on Linux Ubuntu servers. Thanks, and love your show, David. So, Steve, I'm going to actually probably throw this one to you. Do you know much about essentially shadow copies and how that would work on Linux?
So I don't know the Windows side of things pretty much at all, but I am familiar with how, for example, a VM is able to motion from one host to another. And it's a similar idea at cloning a hard drive as it is moving a VM from one host to the other. And it has to do with essentially taking a point in time and doing your best to do a backup, and then attempting to rectify any changes that have happened from that point. So let's take a really good example. Okay, you decide I'm going to take a snapshot right now, right? I want to take a backup. My system is live. So the system has to take a guess of like, okay, I'm going to make a point in time and say at 18, 23, and 23 seconds, this is when I'm going to start copying all of my data. And by the time I get done, maybe it's 18, 24, 23. So in that minute's time, it has to then go back and say, okay, what has changed over the last minute? And then recopy those files. And so it's kind of a complicated process to make a concise point in time on a live image. I'm not aware of any software that does this specifically for the Linux desktop. I'm sure that there are some out there, but it is quite difficult. And probably the best way to do this would actually be to have a file system like ZFS that has this built in, because at ZFS, it's basically able to take a snapshot instantaneously, and it doesn't have to go back and figure out what blocks have changed since I took my snapshot.
You can join the discussion by going to geeklab.ninja. There you can also join our interactive Jitsi room. Atypical joins us from the Jitsi room. Hey, Atypical.
Yeah, so to tie into what Steve was saying, ButterFS also has the ability to do snapshots. And from Conan in the chat, he's saying that TimeShift also supports ButterFS snapshots. So a snapshot, for those that don't know, is on a copy on write file system. It takes a snapshot of the environment right then, and then lets everything continue writing to the disk. So you have a instantaneous snapshot of what the file system looks like at that time. Awesome. So using file systems that are copy on write, ZFS, ButterFS, and using those snapshots and backing up based off the snapshot would give him what he's looking for.
There we go. And we found something that ButterFS can do that ZFS presumably can't, or at least isn't specifically designed to, as there aren't GUI front ends to manage it. So that's kind of exciting too. Scott writes in with our fourth email and says, "Hi, Noah. I recently got a disruption from my home internet service due to a power outage. In order to restore internet service, I bought a Netgear 1200 LTE modem. While the modem worked fine with my Ting T-Mobile SIM card for browsing, I was unable to forward ports on my pfSense box to my local computers. I confirmed that the modem was in bridge mode and then checked the WAN address on the pfSense, which was a 30.xx. According to what is my IP, the IP address was a 172.xx. I see the port forwarding didn't work, or I see why the port forwarding didn't work, but I'm unclear on why I have two different seemingly public IP addresses. I'm hoping that you can shed some light on what's happening here or offer a workaround to get around port forwarding over LTE. Thanks for all you do, Scott. So, cell phone networks often have their own little network inside of the internet. And so your quote unquote public IP address, your real public IP address versus the IP address that your hotspot, even in a bridge mode, is handing out may be different. Steve, your thoughts on this before we even got on air? You were saying this is also likely an issue of double NAT because of carrier grade.
Yeah, so if you remember back to our networking stuff, we talked about NAT, which is the network address translation. So how you go from a public IP to a private IP. So what happens in these cases often is that the public IP is actually buried behind a bunch of networking in the telco's data center. So like, for example, Ting will have a public IP somewhere. But in order for them to cut down on network overhead, they're not going to issue all of their clients a public IP. They give them an internal Ting IP, and then that gets out to the internet. And so what's actually happening is there's multiple layers of translation that's happening, which is why the port forwarding doesn't work. In order for it to work, Ting would have to port forward for you to your little LTE modem, and then your LTE modem has to be in bridge mode to pass it through to pfSense, which could then forward the port. And this is really, really tricky. And the only real way to get out of this is to basically create a VPN out to a point where your pfSense connects to a VPN outside of all of that stuff that you can't control, and then you forward ports that way.
And you could do that on DigitalOcean with something like WireGuard, have WireGuard reach out to like a DigitalOcean droplet, and then the DigitalOcean droplet becomes your public IP. That becomes your ingress point, and then all of your data flows in between that data center connection. So, could be a thought for you. Our fifth email comes in from, I hope I get this right, Yakok. Yakok writes in and says, Noah, what router would you suggest for a home that has a dedicated Wi-Fi user for a corporate working from home job and 30 devices that connect to the home network? I've heard you talk about Ubiquiti products on your show before, but I also thought you've used Microtech. I've searched the show notes and listened to try to see where you stand today. Thanks, Yakok. So, I have recommended Microtech products for a long time. But one of the things that initially drew me to Microtech, and one of the reasons I really like them, is that they're a company that builds network carrier grade products specifically for WISPs. And so they fit perfectly well in an ISP. And the great thing about Microtech is you can use the same routing operating system that they use on their $30,000 router all the way down to a $35 router that you can buy on Amazon and have shipped to your house. So that's where Microtech excels. Now, as far as the interface, as far as their commitment to open source, as far as the community around them, that's where Microtech kind of falls off. It's a really powerful router that you can get for a really low budget. And so I think that's where it really shines. If you have a budget of $200 or more, I would highly encourage you to look at pfSense. And we have switched all of our standard deployments at Altispeed over to pfSense. We do it in a couple of different ways. The entry-level Netgate device that you can buy is an $1,100 is a $200 device called the SG1100, and that is a basic pfSense firewall, and we have used that successfully in fairly large environments to include hotels, which have hundreds of connected devices all at the same time. Now, with VLANs, you can go ahead, even though there are only 3 physical interfaces on the back of the SG1100, you can break out those interfaces via VLANs onto a switch. And so as a demonstration for a client, we connected a WAN cable into the pfSense WAN port. We created a trunk out of the pfSense into a trunk port on a 48 port switch, and then split out 48 different VLANs, just to demonstrate that just because it's a tiny little box, you can do it. It doesn't necessarily stop your capabilities. And that's largely thanks to the power of pfSense. Now, where Netgate kind of falls down, in my opinion, first of all, they don't officially support virtualization, and that's a huge knock against them if you ask me. When you have a client that has spent $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 on a really nice virtualized host, and then on top of that, they have to go buy an additional piece of hardware to run a piece of software that you could trivially virtualize, that's a very frustrating thing for me to tell a client. And so for those instances, we've started to look a little bit more at OpenSense. The other thing that is frustrating is they don't prevent you from loading it onto your own hardware, but they won't officially support it. And so if you purchase a Netgear device and you pay full price for it, you still don't get support. You have to pay extra for that. And I think it's $500, $300, $500, something like that. And you can get a year of support, but you have to add that on top of that. But you have to have an official Netgate device to get that support that you have to pay on top of. On top of all of that, the cheapest rack mount device you can buy from them is $1,000. And so you are a business, and so you say to yourself, well, we want a little 4U rack or a little 4U wall mount bracket that we're going to put a router, a switch, a PDU, and a patch panel in, and we're just going to have a little network. Maybe you have 15 devices, and your entry-level router starts at $1,000. That's simply just a non-starter for a lot of budgets. And so for those scenarios, again, we've kind of looked more at OpenSense and gone over to Newegg and purchased 1U rack mount router appliances that, to be fair, you can buy them pre-installed with pfSense, although so far as I understand it, you should, if it's coming from China and it has the operating system preloaded, you should at the very minimum reload it. You should also understand that you won't get any support from Netgate if you run into problems with that. So for all of those reasons, depending on where you're at, I would tell you, if you have the budget, go with a pfSense box device. If you're in that $200 budget, you can get away with the $1,100. If you want something that's rack mount, you might consider purchasing a rack mount appliance from something like Newegg and loading pfSense on it yourself. Or if you want to take your chances, just take whatever it comes with. And if you want an official rack mount Netgate device, then your budget has to be $1,000 or more. And those are kind of your options. If you want to virtualize, you can do it for yourself. You could probably virtualize pfSense, but again, they won't officially support it. And so a lot of people have started to move OpenSense for that. But certainly, if you work from home, pfSense is your friend. Part of that comes into the community that's around pfSense. So when you have a problem and you say to yourself, I can't get my VoIP phone, my company just switched to this VoIP platform and that doesn't work, your chances of Googling pfSense blah, blah, blah VoIP platform, not connecting one-way audio, whatever it is, your chances of returning success on pfSense are going to be substantially higher than returning a result on something like Microtech. And so for those reasons, I would highly encourage you to go with pfSense or OpenSense. Additionally, the UI and functionality of pfSense is absolutely amazing. On Microtech, it used to take us about 45 minutes to an hour to set up site-to-site VPN, and we were doing that with IPsec, which wasn't a particularly efficient way of doing it. On pfSense, it's literally minutes, and we're using OpenVPN, and so everything is much more performant. Additionally, you can spin up multiple OpenVPN servers, and so you can have one that's doing a site-to-site for one place, one that's doing site-to-site for another place, and then a third one that's doing like a Road Warrior connection. So if you have all of your work stuff set up from home, let's say, and then you're traveling, you could even VPN back into your house and potentially have your little mini corporate environment sitting there at home, and you're able to access it from anywhere. So a lot of reasons that I would highly encourage you to look at pfSense. Now, Linux Ninja in the chat room says he absolutely loves IPsec. He uses it to get it up and running on Juniper hardware in the data center. And indeed, so one of the things that we do for clients is we have some medical clients that they provide contracted medical services. So either imaging services to other places where the facilities actually take the medical images and then they send them in to our client, and then our client goes in and says, okay, well, I'm going to, as a physician, look at the medical images and render a diagnosis. So in that case, you're working with a number of different hospitals, you're working with a number of different clinics. So HIPAA comes into play there, right? Because we can only allow access to the resources that they need to be able to get access to. Additionally, it all has to be encrypted because of patient privacy, right? And so, but we also have to be able to interface with a bunch of different hardware, with a bunch of different protocols and all of that. IPsec is nice because it works with everything. It works with Juniper, it works with Cisco, it works with Zeisel, it works with all of these various brands that all have their different way of doing things, and we can get an IPsec tunnel to come in to pfSense, and then our client just sits there behind their one pfSense box. They have a 7100, and they can see all of these clients, their remote side of their network, and then that hospital exposes the particular particular piece of equipment that we want to pull information from, and you're able to do that. So lots of functionality there built into pfSense. Now, Steve, I know you've been a pfSense user for a long time. What are you running it on hardware-wise, and what do you think of it?
I'm running pfSense on it is kind of like a NUC-like, but I specifically chose the one that has the AES and I offloading on the CPU, and I haven't had any problems with it. I've never exceeded or even came close to hitting the 1 gig because I've never been in a place where internet is like that. So ask me in a couple of weeks, because I'm getting gigabit internet this week, and this will be the first time I'm throwing that at this little box, and we'll see how it does.
In the news this week, I want to start out by talking about a new open source device that is going to help with timekeeping. Now, I want to start by saying this. Every device that keeps time suffers from drift. Drift is your clock will not stay accurate for very long. Now, you can see this in a very simplistic fashion. If you go find like a grandfather clock, you'll see that over time, as the pendulums run out of weight, the clock slows down and it stops. You'll see that in battery-operated devices, that as the battery gets weaker, the clock slows down, the hands slow down on the watch, right? And it eventually stops. But even digital devices suffer from drift. There is no such thing as a device that keeps perfect time. So the closest we have is what's known as atomic time. Now, atomic time is using cesium-123, and the atoms essentially oscillate, and they oscillate so precisely, to be exact, 9,192,631,770 times in a second. And so we can measure that, and we can determine exactly what 1 second is. Now, even a cesium-133 atom that's oscillating is not perfect, but it drifts 1 second in, get this, 100 million years. So for our purposes, it's essentially perfect. And so this is being done, but unless, of course, you want to handle nuclear material on your wrist, which is not feasible for most people, let alone in their house, that's not a viable option. So there are two ways that we transmit this information out of a facility that has a perfect timekeeping device based on cesium-133. And the first way is over a device called a GNSS receiver, which is essentially what's used to send time over the GPS, Global Positioning System. Obviously, a latitude and longitude is what we eventually want to determine, but the satellites are in orbit, and so they use time to calculate exact positions. So we can get an exact time over the radio. I will be a geek here for a second and regress to nerdom and tell you that you can also get an exact time by tuning into 10 kilohertz. And you'll hear on any single sideband receiver, you can tune in and you can hear the signal being broadcast. And you'll hear a tone. It'll go at the tone, the time is, and then, at this point, 6:37 p.m. Beep. And that tells you the exact point in time where you could set your watch or sync up. Now, obviously, listening to a verbal radio broadcast, probably not the most efficient way to sync a bunch of servers, so Facebook wanted to find a better way. Currently, the best way to synchronize a computer's time system is to use something called NTP, or Network Time Protocol. Now, Network Time Protocol works about how you might expect. It's tied to the atomic time service, and so it takes a signal and then encodes it into a network packet, and then we send it over the network. And so this is how your computer, this is how your cell phone is often getting time. Well, actually, your cell phone can do it two ways. It can actually use the GNSS receiver, or it can get it over NTP. But I digress. When you check that little box that says automatically set my time and date, that's how it's doing it. It's getting over NTP. And so various companies run NTP servers that either go out to a more authoritative server or have a GNSS receiver built in and then produce network time protocol. So a group of Facebook engineers sat down and said, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so they built a more accurate timekeeping device that literally fits on a PCI Express card. And then they contributed this to the Open Compute Project. Now, you might remember we talked about the Open Compute Project a few weeks ago. This is a new way to think about building data centers. At a basic level, Oleg Oblevork, a production engineer at Facebook, says it's simply pinging this device to keep time on the server. And so each device reports in and is able to establish time. Now, the timekeeping boxes, they have commercial timekeeping boxes that have a GNSS receiver in them and then produce this network time protocol inside of a data center so that if the internet fails, they can still keep time. Because obviously making sure everything is operating on the same time is hugely important in IT, especially when you get to backups and stuff like that. If you're shutting something down and something has to back up and something has to come back up, making sure everything is operating on the exact same clock can be essential. But the problem is that these time appliances rely on a couple of key components. So that GNSS receiver that I spoke about, which is essentially a high stability oscillator, and the other side of that is that these boxes are proprietary in nature. And so when they needed security features, or when they needed maintenance, or when they needed to monitor what was going on, they always had to go back to the vendor and they would ask for a new feature, or they would ask to be able to look into something. And then they would get answers like, well, that's a proprietary box, we can't really share that with you. Or if they did make some changes, it would take a long time to get there. And even then the changes wouldn't be exactly what they wanted. So they said, we are going to start from scratch. And so they designed this device, an open timekeeping appliance that has this GNSS receiver in it, and then receives is able to keep perfect time, or at least as close as we can get to perfect time, and then send that out and allow other servers to sync over NTP. Steve, I don't know if you've worked in a data center per se, but undoubtedly you've dealt with NTP. What do you think about encoding this onto a single PCI device?
So I definitely work with NTP, and it has been not only critical but also a big bane, because things like authentication will fail if you're in some of my environments. If you're a second or two off, your auth will fail because of how sensitive the environment is. Keeping it on a PCIe card, that's interesting. I haven't read too much about how this is working, so I can't really comment, but I would say that for some of my clients where they are willing to be that stringent on the time, I could see them adopting something like this.
Linux Ninja in the chat room says that if they had a server in production that was off by more than 12 milliseconds, they had to take that server offline and then troubleshoot why the clock wasn't in sync. I guess I've never worked for a client that has had that tight of a time constraint with NTP. Typically, as long as we're in the same hour, we're close enough, because that's where we start to affect backups and stuff like that. But I have dealt with this in a large degree in broadcast, because so in broadcast, every second counts. And so oftentimes what you'll do is you'll be taking a feed from a network. And so the network comes in at a specific time and exits at a specific time. And the automation system has to be able to switch the inputs on and off right when that happens. And so there's a couple of different ways that happens in broadcast, but one of them is using a pre-done clock. And so in that scenario, If one studio is coming offline, a network's coming online, and then the network's coming offline, another studio is being brought online, all of that has to happen at the exact right second. Otherwise, you cut off the end of the news broadcast, or you cut off the beginning of the live local talent, and those kinds of things. And so they have a master clock that sits inside of most radio stations that, again, syncs out. They just sync it to NTP because, again, as long as we're within a second, it's probably close enough. Certainly not milliseconds. But that's going over NTP, and so time is critically important. So the idea that an open source device that comes out that you can install on your computer is hugely exciting to me. Additionally, I find it incredibly encouraging that the Facebook engineers designed this to be open source from the get-go. They didn't slow down. They didn't back off. They said, no, even though we're Facebook, and I think Facebook gets oftentimes a really bad rap for the way that they fund Facebook, but the truth is the geeks behind the scenes do some really fantastic work. They do some really fantastic work with ButterFS, and they do some really fantastic work with the Open Compute Project, and this is just another tremendous example of how they're contributing to the open source community. So you can read more if you want the gory details. We'll have the TechCrunch article linked in the show notes, podcast.asknoahshow.com. Element is introducing voice messages. So a new version of Element is out. It's available on all 3 platforms. You can read more at element.io on their blog. And they introduce voice messages. So this is now introduced as a first-class citizen. On mobile, you now get a little microphone button, and you have a couple different options. You can either hold the microphone button to record a voice message, which then can be played back on the other recipient's device or the group's device, or you can drag it up to lock the recorder if you're sending a very long message, and then you can review that message before you choose to send it. They also give you the little animated waveform. Now, this has been a highly requested feature from Element, and I know, having used Element as a production messenger at Altispeed, oftentimes I get texts in the field that say, hey, you know what, can we just jump on a call because it's easier to explain it? And if I'm busy and we need to do that asynchronously, that's proven to be kind of a downfall. And so as soon as this feature was announced, I ran into our team room and I was like, guys, look at this. And they're like, this is amazing. This is going to change everything. So that's really fantastic, but it doesn't stop there. They've also introduced an entirely new design for one-to-one voice message and video calls. So this is apart from the native Jitsi integration. This is direct one-to-one voice communication. So you can create a call just as if you were calling somebody on the phone, and it comes complete with screen sharing on Element Web and the desktop. They also have improved the intelligent call entries in your conversation timeline. So it now tells you how long you were on a call and will even let you answer calls from the timeline on web or desktop. They're also going to tell the other person when you're on mute. And so you can even play the switchboard and put the call on hold if you need to step away for a second or something like that. Now, if you look hard enough, you're going to be able to find the dial pad. And while the dial pad isn't probably particularly useful for most users today, what it does is it signals that they're getting ready to let you talk on the public phone network in the future. This is massive. When we had Matthew on right after Southeast Linux Fest, he spoke about this public network or public telephone network integration into Element. And so the skinny is this: you will be able to use Element as a SIP client for your business. And so your phone calls come in, they hit the phone tree, whatever, and you say, hey, I want to dial, Noah's extension. You dial Noah's extension. Instead of getting a call on my cell phone, which is where it comes now, either gets forwarded to my cell phone or comes in through the app. Now that app is Element. So if I'm on Element, which I pretty much live on all day long, it comes in on my desktop, it comes in on the web, it comes in on my phone. I can call other people in my organization, and it all happens in one messaging platform. Now, one of the most important things that they feel like they finally killed off is the old gray, green, black transition that used to show sending of messages. So it would show you when the message had been transmitted to the server, when it had been posted to the room, and then when the recipient had actually read or seen the message. And the problem was it gave an unfair impression about how fast or slow the app was. In practice, the speed at which the message was able to be sent was actually really being limited by the network. So now they've changed it. There's a little circle, and the circle, when you send a message, is filled with a little check mark when the message is received by the server, when it's been posted to the room. And then once people read the message, their chat head moves down to show you that they've then seen that message. Another huge improvement in the timeline is the addition of blurred placeholder thumbnails on Element Web and desktop and Android. And so this technique is called blur hash, and it lets the sender include a very small, compact description of the blurred thumbnail when they send a file, the thumbnail on Matrix. And what that means is instead of seeing the little blank thumbnail gap, it now shows you a blurred image that will get clearer as the image actually downloads. And so that's available in the latest release. On encryption, they've made some major improvements on Element Web and desktop a few days ago. When you invite somebody into a private encrypted conversation, the app will automatically share the conversation history with them, assuming that the history is set to be visible. Previously, this silently failed. It was a huge bummer for us, actually, because a lot of the rooms that we use at Altispeed have to be encrypted because we either have customer information in there or there's stuff that just can't get out into the public. And so the problem is we invite a new team member in and somebody will say, well, scroll back up and chat and go grab this piece of information. Well, that doesn't actually work, or at least it didn't actually work. It will now. The biggest thing by far that they have on the horizon is Spaces, and this will be coming out of beta. And this is going to be letting everyone curate a set of rooms. So it's essentially your ability to organize your room infrastructure. You can organize them either in private spaces to where you say, here is all of my work chats, here's all my personal chats, here's my most important chats, those kinds of things, as well as community style organization. So you'll find this at Linux Delta. We did this at Southeast Linux Fest this year. You could join the Southeast Linux Fest space and it automatically would allow you to be invited into a particular set of private rooms. And so as long as you're a member of the space, you have the ability to join those private rooms. So we also use that at Altispeed. We hire a new employee, we onboard them, we invite them into the space, and boom, Bob's your uncle. They automatically exist in all of the rooms that we want them to be in there. And so this means that you're not going to have to explicitly invite users to join all of the private rooms in your organization. This is a pretty big change. Now, you just add them to the space. They'll be automatically available to see all of the hierarchy in that space and have the correct permissions. And so they also have landed a community to space migration tool, and this is going to kind of help kill off the community features and move everything over to spaces as gracefully as possible. And I've seen this come up in discussions before. Say, hey, really excited that you have this new ability to have spaces, but what's going to happen to the old communities if we've been using it? They're trying to migrate that as gracefully as they can. PineNote is in the news again, a high-end e-ink reader and the most powerful Quartz 64 single-board computer available. You can read more at pine64.org. They've also released the PinePhone keyboard, and that has now entered production. And so this is going to give you a physical keyboard on the PinePhone. So by far the biggest announcement here, and you can go to their website to see a list of everything they do. Again, I can't commend Pine64 enough for the way and the clarity and the transparency in which they give their potential customers and the community. But the PineNote is easily the biggest announcement here. It is one of the, if not the most powerful e-ink device available on the market. And it shares the Quartz 64 pedigree, sporting the same RK3566 quad-core A55 SoC paired with 4 gigabytes of RAM and 128 gigs of eMMC flash storage. Now, the PineNote is fitted with 2 microphones. It features 2 speakers. It charges with USB-C for fast charging as well as data, and includes a 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi AC. The inner frame, or the midsection, is made out of magnesium alloy, so this is very similar to the Pinebook Pros. And then the back of it is a grippy plastic cover that has cutouts for the speakers. Now, the e-ink panel itself is covered with a scratch-resistant, glare-reducing hardening glass, and the entire assembly comes in at just 7 millimeters thick, which, by the way, is 1 millimeter thinner than the Kindle Oasis 3. So if you've ever had a chance to pick one of those up and you kind of get an idea of the thickness of the Oasis 3, this is going to be 1 millimeter thinner. The screen is 10.3 inches, a 3x4 panel. Get this, resolution 1404 by 1876. That's 227 dpi, and can display 16 levels of grayscale. So a couple things here. This is Pine64. Every time I buy a Pine device, I pay whatever it is I pay for it, and I get it, and I think to myself, man, this is easily worth twice the amount of money I pay for it. I would have easily paid twice the amount of money that I paid for this thing. And that tells me a couple of things. First, it tells me that they are an insane value for what you pay for them. But the second thing that comes into play here is that when you buy these devices, they're constantly under-promising and over-delivering. They constantly tell you you're going to get this thing, and then you get more. And so every time I've ever held a Pine device, I've been pleasantly surprised. It would have been completely acceptable to me if they had come out with a low-resolution screen. At the end of the day, it's literally just displaying text. Why do you need a super high-resolution screen? And this screen at 1404 by 1872 has a higher resolution than most of the laptops I see being sold at Best Buy for $900. It has, again, like I said, 16 levels of grayscale. It features a front light with a cool white to warm amber light adjustment. Then on top of the e-ink panel sits a capacitive glass layer for the finger touch based input. They have a Wacom electromagnet EMR based pen input, and I wasn't aware of this, but that EMR pen input is a universal standard. So Wacom sells a bunch of different EMR pens, and you can buy third-party EMR pens. So they're going to be selling an EMR pen with the PineNote, but if you don't like it, or if you already have an EMR pen that you're used to, well, the PineNote is going to work great as long as it's compatible with that Wacom EMR standard. It features a faint LED power for an on-off indicator, as well as a previous next page, and an eraser button. Now, I want to be clear about this because Pine64 is clear about this. The PineNote is available for early adopters for $399. But what you have to understand is that the early adopter edition, it's a full device. So they ship with the magnetic cover. It works with the onboard hall sensor. They have, you can put the device to sleep and it can work with the pen. But they're going to be shipping this device with a Manjaro atop a BSP kernel 4.19, and unless they get the drivers to work with kernel 5.xx, in which case then they'll iterate on that kernel. But the user interface that they're currently working with at the KDE folks is trying to figure out if Plasma Mobile is going to work, or if they need to make some tweaks, or if that's even really the best fit for the device. And so they're not really sure how that's going to work. And so they're very open and honest. The software on this device, it's not finished yet. It's a prototype. And so if you're looking to buy a PineNote in the first batch, then they say, and I'm quoting here, you must expect to write software for it, not write notes on it. The software shipping from the factory will be the first batch not sustainable for taking notes, reading ebooks, writing your dissertation. It may not even boot into a graphical environment, but we're still excited for what you'll be able to create on this device and take the journey with you. By the way, this is the exact same level of transparency that they gave us with the PineBook. It's the exact same level of transparency that we got with the PineTime. All of those devices, and the PinePhone, all of those devices drastically exceeded my expectations. All of those devices eventually got to a point where it was as good as any other production device. My PineBook is easily better than any Chromebook I've ever used. Oh, by the way, I can load whatever operating system I want onto it. Oh, by the way, it's literally groundbreaking as far as what you're getting for the price point that you're getting at. So I don't have enough good things to say about the PineNote, and I can't tell you how fast I am going to run, not walk, to the Pine store and purchase one of these. I absolutely am happy to put my own software on it. I'm absolutely happy to watch this device unfold because A, I'm sure they're probably going to increase the price later on. It's also the best e-ink device out there. And oh, by the way, I've been looking for one for a long time. I haven't found one that worked natively with Linux. I didn't find one that didn't work well with the cloud. This checks all of the boxes. Steve, have you ever thought about an e-ink device? And if so, what do you think about the PineNote?
I have an old Sony one, and I used it for a long time. I still have it. I just never got around to using it again because with the type of shift in work that I do, Audible makes more sense. But if I was more stationary, I did really enjoy reading on on an e-reader. And I've actually looked at the Pine stuff quite a few times, and when I was in Canada, it was much harder to get, and it's been in and out of stock, or I would probably already have the Pine tablet.
I'll tell you this, I'll be honest with you, I really struggle with just sitting down and reading. My attention span doesn't really lend itself to it. And I also don't have a lot of time to just sit there and read. So like you, I tend to consume books over audio form. However, Documentation is almost always comes to me in written form. I also try to be as simplistic as I can when it comes to reading the Bible, because I don't like super complicated things there. I want to get away from distractions. And then when it comes to taking notes, I just want to be able to jot things down with my hand. And all of those things have led me down the path of a notepad. Now, I will be honest with you and tell you that I've continued to explore the idea of a companion device. And right now, I'm slowly moving off of Sailfish OS onto my GPD Pocket, mostly because there are just more features on the GPD Pocket. But when I see what is coming out with the PineNote, I say to myself, a lot of the things that I want to do, reference a piece of documentation, jot a quick note down, take some time to read uninterrupted and away from the internet and away from distractions, the PineNote, again, checks all of those boxes. And so I kind of envision a world in where people can come in and say to me, hey, I just joined your company. And I say, okay, well, here's your laptop, here's your phone, here's your YubiKey. Oh, by the way, here's your PineNote. And on your PineNote, you'll find a copy of our employee manual. And so you can go there and read a list of all of our policies and stuff like that. You'll also find a folder that has all of the documentation for the software that we deploy by default, the hardware that we deploy by default. We have something called a quick reference guide that basically has like, hey, I'm in an emergency and I have blank problem with, virtualization, routing, whatever. How do I fix these things? And then there's a flow chart to go through and troubleshoot those things. Having those available on a device that doesn't require the internet probably is excellent on battery life, and you can reference and have just in your bag seems absolutely fantastic. So I, again, don't have enough good things to say about the PineNote. When I get mine, I'll let you know what I think of it. But if everything else that Pine64 has done is any indication, then what you'll get for $399 is probably closer to a $700 or $800 e-reader. Hey, the music in my ears means we're out of time, but don't fear. The show continues 24/7, 365 over at AskNoahShow.com. Podcast.AskNoahShow.com if you'd like to get all of the show notes and articles that we use to reference and create the show, as well as a bunch of stuff that we just didn't have time to get to. You can follow me on Twitter at Colonel Linux. You can follow the show at Ask Noah Show. We'll be back next Tuesday. We record live every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central. AskNoahShow.com. Have a good week.